it's Shirley. Welcome back to my channel. You already saw the title, so you know what this video is about. I'm going to cover everything GMAT related. I'll talk about the actual exam itself, how to best prepare, and then the actual resources that I used to prep for the GMAT, as well as kind of my review of them. And then I'll take you through my own personal GMAT journey. So to start off, for better or worse, the GMAT is still a really critical component of your application for a business school and some other grad programs. It's really important not only for admissions, but also just for merit consideration for scholarships, fellowships, etc. I mean, it's kind of a vanity metric, but everybody cares about it because it's kind of just a standardized, easy heuristic. School rankings are kind of a vanity metric. GMAT scores are also a vanity metric, but schools are ranked on the GMAT scores of their incoming classes. And so since it factors into a school's ranking, you better believe they care. A high GMAT can make other areas of your application, which may be a little bit less compelling, more forgivable. So if you have a lower GPA, maybe less work experience, maybe non-traditional background, a high GMAT score will definitely help. So my first piece of advice before you start studying for the exam is to really understand the GMAT exam itself. Understand how the exam is designed and how it's scored. So first thing to know is that the GMAT exam is adaptive, which means that it adjusts to your performance, which means that the better you do, the harder it gets. And I think a lot of us are not used to taking exams like that. We tend to think of exams as being static. We don't really expect a test to increase in difficulty if we're doing better, but that's exactly what the GMAT does. This can really shake your confidence because you're gonna get questions wrong. And it, of course, feels bad when you're getting questions wrong, but actually the point of the GMAT is not to never get questions wrong, it's to only get hard questions wrong. The exam actually scores you on the difficulty of the questions that you're missing, not on the number of questions that you missed. You can actually miss just as many questions as someone who scores much higher or much lower than you. That doesn't determine your ultimate score. What determines your ultimate score is the difficulty of the questions that you're missing. Also, timing really matters on the GMAT, and this is going to be harder than you think because, as I said, it's adaptive, and so questions are going to get harder and harder, and there are just going to be some questions that you're not going to be able to get, and you have to know when to give up on those, because if you don't, you run the risk of running out of time and missing easier questions, and you really don't want to be getting easy questions wrong. Again, back to my previous point, you want to only be missing the hard questions because that's how the exam is scoring you. So yeah, timing really matters. Know when to take a loss. You have to learn how to make mistakes on the GMAT. If you time it, you really only have about 2 minutes per question, which goes faster than you think, especially if it's a difficult question. And you want to solve it through, especially if you already started working on it, you're like, I just want to finish this question so I can get it right, but you kind of have to know when to cut your losses early. If you've started to work on a problem and you still are not 100% sure about the answer, but you've already spent around 2 minutes on it, I would just make an educated guess and move on. Hopefully you'll be able to narrow down the possible answers, but I wouldn't waste more time trying to get that one question 100% correct. Number 2, take a ton of mock exams. Taking the GMAT is really not just about knowing the material that's going to be on the test, but really knowing how to take the exam. There are many factors about the GMAT that make it challenging, the fact that it's adaptive, and because of that, timing is a difficulty for almost everyone who takes the exams. It has to be able to adapt to your performance just like the GMAT, otherwise it's not a good simulation of the actual exam. Also, mock exams are really helpful to help you get a baseline understanding of what you should be scoring, the range you should be scoring in, and also just to get a general sense of the concepts that you find most challenging, so you can drill those. So here are all the materials that I personally used to prep for the GMAT and my personal review of all of them. So Manhattan Prep was probably my top resource for several reasons. First of all, they give you 6 practice CAT exams, and as I said before, mock exams are really important to help you get comfortable with taking the GMAT. Also, Manhattan Prep is known to be pretty rigorous. I think some have said that they're just as challenging, if not more challenging, than the actual GMAT. They're also known for their quantitative prep, prep. And lastly, I really like them because they allow for very targeted prep. So some GMAT resources can be very general, but Manhattan Prep, I think the edition of the books that I used was the 6th edition, and they broke out every concept that's covered on the GMAT into its own book. So you could do really, really targeted practice. If there was a specific concept that you knew you kept missing on the exams, you could really just drill that particular concept. So I liked how tactical it was in that way. You don't have to review just everything. You can kind of just focus on what you need to focus on. They're also known for their quant prep. I really wanted to prep for the quant section more than the verbal section. Not necessarily because it was more important. I'll discuss that in a bit more depth a little bit later. But for me, verbal was just not really something that I felt I needed to practice too much. The other resource that I used was the official GMAT guide. This is the only study guide that's published by GMAT, who actually writes the GMAT exam. So yeah, it should be noted that every other test prep service out there, whether it's Manhattan Prep or another test prep service, they're all still ultimately just trying to replicate what GMAT writes on the GMAT exam, but they aren't the actual authors of that exam. The only organization that actually writes the GMAT exam is GMAT, and they are the ones that publish the official GMAT study guide. So there is no resource that is more faithful to the actual GMAT exam. I would say that the official GMAT guide is most helpful to just get a sense of what the exam is actually like, how it's written. But I think generally the official guide is pretty general practice. It's pretty comprehensive. So I would maybe start there, and then you can kind of get a sense of what your areas to focus on are, and once you figure that out, I would turn to more targeted prep, because I think that honestly some test prep is better for verbal and some is better for quant. So the official GMAT guide starter kit also comes with 2 mock exams, and I believe that they use past GMAT questions, like actual real questions that have been on the GMAT before, that maybe they've since retired. So with the purchase of the starter kit, you get 2 mock exams with the option to purchase up to 6 in total. I think I ended up purchasing 4, either 4 or 6. I definitely bought more than just the original 2, but yeah, practice exams are just really, really important. I don't know, I can't really stress that enough. So another general study tip, the best way to study anything is to test yourself, test your knowledge, actually practice. Reviewing notes and kind of just like reading through concepts are only going to help you in the beginning when you're building a foundational understanding of the material. It's been shown time and time again that the most effective study strategy is to quiz yourself. So whether that's flashcards or writing out actual questions and then actually solving them, the act of having to perform memory recall in order to solve that question is going to help you retain that information much better. It's really easy to read through a problem and follow every step and be like, okay, that all makes sense. But when you actually do it yourself without having to read through what's been done before, you encounter possible pieces that you may have been missing, and so the act of doing that helps you form the whole picture in your own mind. Another tip is to actually get feedback as much as possible. So ideally, you would do a problem, and then immediately after doing the problem, you would look at the solution so you can know instantly what you did wrong. Because when you do something wrong, that's actually when your brain is the most plastic. Andrew Huberman has talked about this, but it's also been shown in other studies that when you get something wrong, your brain is the most plastic and most open and receptive to learning. So when you do a problem and you get it wrong, or even if you get it right, that's when you should be checking the solution immediately after, so you can quickly learn from your mistakes. If you don't check your work immediately, you're not going to catch your mistake, and you're going to stay in the same pattern, the same habit loop of making that same mistake over and over again. So ideally, you do want to get as quick of feedback as possible. However, when you're taking the mock exams, you obviously can't be checking your work after every question. And so I think it's really important that you do both when you study. It's really important to take mock exams just so you can get used to building the endurance of sitting through, I think it's a 3-hour exam. How long is it again? Yeah, it's around 3 hours. That's a long time to be thinking, really focusing on an exam. So you should be taking mock exams just to get a sense of how the actual exam is going to be. Just building your endurance to sit through a 3-hour cognitively demanding test practicing your timing, knowing how to get questions wrong, simulating the actual test environment. It's been shown that if you practice in the same environment as the actual test environment, you're more likely to do better. But I think the other component of test prep that's also really important is just when you're doing drills on a concept that you're trying to understand, I would do question, check your answer, do your question, check your answer as fast as you can, so that again you can learn your mistakes and correct them as early as possible, so you don't keep continuing to make those mistakes. Like, for example, if you were to do let's just say you struggled with let's just say you've really struggled with reading comprehension type of concept on the GMAT. You do one question related to reading comprehension, you make a mistake, you do other questions, another one is going to be related to reading comprehension, the same kind of concept. You make the same mistake because you haven't learned it yet, the mistake that you're making. So you're actually not only not learning, but you're reinforcing a bad habit. You're reinforcing that mistake. So that's why it's really important to catch your mistakes early, which is why I think it's just important to do like quick bursts of like, do a practice problem, check the answer immediately. Okay, let's talk about the verbal versus the quant section on the exam. There's also integrated reasoning and analytical writing. I'm not going to go into those sections in depth because they're really not factored into your overall score, and I mean, schools do look at them. I don't really think that they're considered very heavily, so I'm just not going to go into that. So schools do tend to look at your quant score more just to make sure that you can handle the quantitative nature of an MBA curriculum, but I definitely think it's a mistake to overlook the verbal component. So the verbal component is actually a bigger contributor to your overall score than the quant section, and the reason for that is to kind of help domestic applicants when they're applying to business school, because the sad reality is that American applicants tend not to be as strong in the quantitative section as international applicants. The US school system just doesn't have the same level of rigor when it comes to our quantitative subjects than other international school systems. So international applicants tend to kill the quant section. They score really high in the quant section. So in an effort to help more domestic applicants be successful applicants, the verbal portion of the GMAT is factored more heavily into the final score. I'm not saying whether this is fair or unfair or right or wrong, but it just is what it is. So that's something you should know when you're prepping for the GMAT. That being said, I do think that the GMAT is known to be more difficult quantitatively, and the verbal section is a little bit easier. I have heard that people who are interested in really practicing their verbal, they'll sometimes study for the GRE, because the GRE is actually easier quantitatively, but the verbal component I think is very difficult. I think I've also heard some people say that they might prep for the LSAT because the verbal component of the LSAT is also quite challenging. For me, the verbal component, I still studied it. I literally was in ESL classes, which is English as a second language classes, when I was in elementary school. And yeah, I remember my third grade teacher telling me I struggled with English. My dad actually had me like write essays, and like he's also not a native English speaker, but he would just have me write essays and he would critique them with me, and I think that helped. It really became something that I worked on in elementary school, was just like my writing abilities and my English. And I also really love to read. I've always loved to read growing up, and I think that actually that helps a lot with writing. I think people don't realize sometimes, but reading helps a lot with your writing abilities, and also just general reading comprehension, which is important on the verbal section. So yeah, honestly, studying the verbal component of the GMAT, I wouldn't say like reading more books is like the most direct way to prep for it, but it does help. Also, interesting side note, but I recently learned on a podcast that reading more fiction helps you develop more empathy, which is cool. But yeah, I really wanted to focus on quant. Even though I studied math in undergrad, my major was literally math econ. The quantitative concepts on the GMAT are actually like not that advanced. I think they cover up to like calculus 1 or 2 and some stochastic probability, but only a very small portion of the GMAT is going to be related to probability, and most of the concepts are actually not that advanced. It's just the fact that you have to find creative ways to solve these quantitative problems in a really limited amount of time. So if you had all the time in the world, I think you could sit down and definitely solve these problems and they wouldn't be that hard. It's just that combined with how fast you have to be able to find a solution, that is the real challenge. And I was like sometimes finishing the verbal part early, but I was always running out of time on the quant because there were just problems that like I didn't know how to give up fast enough. So anyways, my personal GMAT journey. The first time I took the exam, I scored a 690. I attribute a lot of that to the fact that, I mean, it was my first time taking the exam, so nerves, but also the proctor had cut into my exam time. You do get like scratch paper when you are taking the exam, and I write really big. I'd run out of scratch paper, and so I was trying to get the proctor's attention. She was supposed to be paying attention to the test takers, obviously, but she didn't see me for like a good 5 minutes. And so 5 minutes is not that long, but it actually matters a lot. Every second matters a lot on the GMAT because, again, timing is really, really important. And I think even worse was the fact that like I knew time was running out, and so it was like I was just not in the right mindset because obviously like I just was not going to score as high because even if they'd taken 1 minute away, that would have been a problem. But yeah, I think like even worse was just the anxiety that I had knowing that I lost 5 minutes on the exam. I just was not in the right mindset to go back to the exam after that. I was so flustered and so anxious, and so I scored a 690 the first time, but in practice I was consistently, and I'd taken a lot of practice at this point, like so many mock exams, and I was pretty consistently scoring between a 720 to a 740. So I felt pretty confident that I could do better than a 690. So I immediately wrote the proctor. I think it was Pearson that proctored my exam, and then I wrote GMAT, and they provided me with a retake of the GMAT. And then the second time I took it, I scored a 750. I think the highest I'd ever scored in practice was maybe like a 760, and that was a complete anomaly. So I was really happy getting the 750. I didn't really expect to score that high. So this is what I scored on the GMAT. I got a 750 overall, 47 verbal, 47 quant, a 5 analytical writing, and an 8 integrated reasoning. But yeah, that was my entire GMAT process and all my best advice for those of you who are prepping for the GMAT and applying to business school. I really hope you found this video helpful. If you have any other questions or if there's something that I didn't cover, please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.